What's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's Limited Level Ups. We've got a good old-fashioned 3-for-1 coming your way this week. I was writing notes for this episode, and I was trying to figure out on what I wanted to focus on this week, and I was thinking, okay, draft navigation is really tricky in this format. I want to talk about that for sure, but also there's like this handful of cards I really want to talk about, but also I have some thoughts on gameplay that I think are good to touch on. So I figured we're just going to do it all. We're going to break this down into 3 mini Tarkir level ups. One section focused on draft navigation, one section focused on individual cards, and one section focused on gameplay. Let's just jump in. All right, so first off, draft navigation. Last week, if you caught last week's episode, I also put a heavy emphasis on draft navigation and how important it was to understanding this format. My feelings on that haven't really changed. I think that Tarkir is just one of the most complex formats we've had in a long time as far as draft navigation goes. In the past, I've talked about how I see draft in general as having 2 phases. Phase 1 is navigating into the right lane, into the right deck, figuring out your general archetype. And then phase 2, which comes, maybe middle of pack 2, or if your lane's really open and you figure out your lane pretty early, maybe the end of pack 1. After that, you move into the deck building phase, where you're no longer trying to figure out your archetype or your lane. You're trying to say, okay, well, what does my particular deck need? Maybe I picked up a bunch of good 2-drops early, so I need to pick up some top end later. Maybe my early picks were removal, so I need to get good threats in this deck instead, right? So kind of just balancing the needs of the deck. And both of those phases in this format, in Tarkir, I think are really challenging. It can be tricky to navigate into the right lane because the good decks are at polar ends, right? Like, we have Boros aggro on one end, and we've got like 5-color, multicolor soup on the other end. Not a ton of overlap there, and you can kind of find yourself in some tricky spots if you're being inflexible or if you just don't have like, a lot of experience in the format. So that's one part of the complexity. And then 2, once you have figured out, okay, I'm in this deck, I think the specifics are really difficult. If you are a multicolor deck, you have to balance mana fixing and removal and early game and late game and card draw, right? Just so many things. And even the aggro decks, I think, are pretty difficult to balance. I mean, they're maybe a little more straightforward, but it's not just like, okay, jam all the 2-drops and you'll have a good time. It's like, well, you want these specific 2-drops, the ones that make tokens, for example, if you're talking about Boros aggro. And then you want to have the right balance of ways to pump your team, but you also want some removal. But there's also tricks involved, and it's like, what's the balance of tricks and removal spells? And so I think this format, more than others, leads people to either drafting piles of cards that don't really work together, or having a deck that didn't quite get there because they didn't pivot into the right lane in time, or their deck is just missing some critical thing. Maybe it's mana fixing, maybe it's just, they didn't end up with removal. So for this draft navigation part of this episode, I'm going to try to lay out as clearly as I can the ways to avoid ending up in these pile decks that don't really work, that have bad mana, how to figure out how to actually get into the aggro decks when you're supposed to, how to balance all this stuff, because it's a lot of stuff to balance. So the first order of business is laying out the archetypes that I think you're going to want to try to end up in most often. Can't navigate if you don't know your destination. And those decks are red-white aggro, 3 to 5 color green, and Jeskai control. There are a few other decks, some more niche decks that you'll want to keep an eye out for, and we'll touch on those in a bit. But red-white, multicolor green, and Jeskai control, those are the big ones in my mind. And to get a little more granular, I think that red-white aggro and multicolor green are a bit more common than Jeskai. There's this flowchart that I found on Reddit about Tarkir draft navigation, and it's like, did you open a bomb? If yes, then go into a multicolor pile. If no, then move into Boros aggro. And I think this is definitely a bit of an oversimplification, but if you're having trouble with this format, or maybe you're just a newer drafter, if you follow this flowchart and limit yourself just to red-white aggro or multicolor green, I think you're probably going to bump up your win rate by a few points, right? It's not completely optimal, and I really do feel strongly that you want to group Jeskai control in there as one of the big 3. It's the deck that I've actually won the most with, and I think it's pretty strong. But yeah, red-white aggro and multicolor green, those are the most common decks that you're going to see draft in, draft out. And so let's just jump right into the process of how I think you want to be navigating drafts in this format, or at very least how I think about draft navigation in the format. You can take as little or as much of that and map that onto your own process, but we're going to go through a draft log from a draft that I did yesterday. This log in particular, I think was pretty interesting, illustrates a few concepts. Just going through this will let me touch on a few things that I think are important to think about as you open your pack and go to pick 2, pick 3, pick 4. For those listening audio only, you might want to switch over to the YouTube video if you're able to for this. I think you'll have a fine time following along if you don't have access to the YouTube video, but just the context of all the cards in the pack kind of helps here. I'm not going to be talking about every single card in the pack. So yeah, I just thought I'd give that little heads up. Okay, so when I open my pack, my eyes are drawn to whatever the most powerful card in the pack is. And I'm going to want to consider how many colors the card is. Monocolored is obviously more flexible than 2-colored, is more flexible than 3-color. But at the same time, I'm not afraid to take a good 3-color card. And that's exactly what I did here. So my first pick here was Fangkeeper's Familiar. This is the 1 black, green, blue, 3/3 flash. When it enters, you either gain 3 life, surveil 3, destroy an enchantment, or counter target creature spell. This card is very strong. Very happy to take it. And especially, the 3-color cards that are green. These are the ones that I'm more happy to take. The Mardu cards, unless they're great, not as much. Sonic Shrieker, the uncommon Mardu Dragon, or the 4-mana Mardu exile removal spell that drains them for 3. Like, those are pretty strong cards, and I'm happy to add some black mana to my red-white deck for those. But the green 3-color cards especially, I don't feel like they're that inflexible, because green's got the fixing, of course. There's also a teaming Dragonstorm in this pack, which is the white Dragonstorm that makes 2/2 soldiers. And, you pick this up whenever a dragon enters. This card, I think, is the second best card in the pack, just power level-wise, but I think the Familiar is enough better. And there's going to be some picks where the monocolor card is close enough to the 3-color card. I think flexibility still matters. So, say this was the pick between Fangkeeper's Familiar and the blue Dragonstorm, the one that draws 2, you discard 1. I think I would probably take Dragonstorm there because those cards are close enough and you get the flexibility of taking a monocolored card. And it's the same, like in any format, right? You're always weighing power versus flexibility. This is what I talked about last week. But yeah, happy to take the Familiar and currently looking to end up in some sort of multicolor green deck. Also looking to narrow into base 2 colors. In my multicolor green decks, I'm often looking to the blue-green base, sometimes black-green, that happens too. But I'm thinking, okay, I take this Familiar, and I'm on the prowl for blue cards, green cards, not as much black cards, because the blue-green base is better than the black-green base. It's just stronger. But yeah, we take this Familiar, and we go to the next pack. The next pack has a Sibsig Appraiser, the common 2/1 that looks at 2 cards. You take 1, you put 1 in the grave. And the next best card, I would say, is Magmatic Hellkite. This is the red dragon that blows up a land. Your opponent can go search out a land, but it comes in tapped with a stun counter. I think the Appraiser is just the better card. It goes with the Familiar. Awesome. We just take that. The next pick is where it starts to get interesting. So the 2 best cards in the pack are red and a red-white gold card. So we got Static Snare, which is the 5-mana flash enchantment that is cheaper for each attacking creature. Comes in, exiles something until this leaves, and the gold card at uncommon is Frontline Rush. Red-white instant, either make 2 tokens or target creature gets +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures you control. Very good cards for your red-white deck. Really, the only card I'm interested in this pack that goes with my Sibsig Appraiser and Fangkeeper's Familiar is Champion of Doosan, which is the 3-mana green 4/2 trample. Has the renew ability to put a +1/+1 and a trample counter on something. I would say Champion of Doosan is a meaningful amount worse than Static Snare and Frontline Rush. But I do like Champion of Doosan quite a bit in green blue decks that are self-mill heavy. We've already got 2 cards that put cards in the graveyard. Also, the sort of like gravitational pull of my first 2 picks, how strong they are, is pretty strong. Fangkeeper Familiar is one of the better rares. Appraiser is the best common. I think it's fairly reasonable to take Static Snare here if you wanted to. Like I said, I think it's a better card. But I like Champion of Doosan quite a bit. I like this card. I think a little more than most people. Keeping in the back of my head that I saw this Snare, I saw this Frontline Rush. One thing to call out here is that, it's still just pick 3. These aren't huge signals or anything. Somebody took a rare out of this pack and, maybe a good common. This isn't too telling about what's open or not just yet. There just hasn't been enough cards taken from the pack. Really, I'm not thinking about that until pick 4, 5, 6, really. But then we get to the next pack. So this is pick 4. And pick 4 is where I think you really want to think about, okay, well, what am I seeing in this pack? Just broadly, look at all the cards and group them into, Are they 5-color green cards, or are they red-white aggro cards? Because pick 4 is where enough cards have been taken where I think you start to see a picture of what's open and what's not. So the card that is reasonable for me to take here for my prospective Sultai deck is Dismal Backwaters, the tap blue-black land. But I make a judgment call here to take the Quarry Mountain Stalwart for 2 reasons. One, I do think Quarry Mountain Stalwart is pretty darn good in red-white aggro. It's a card I'm happy to play. It's also a card that I'll play in my slower Jeskai decks sometimes, so it's fairly flexible. But 2, the composition of the rest of the pack. So I look at the Sultai cards in this pack. They're all pretty filler. There's nothing I'm very happy to play. And the best cards in the pack, the top 3 cards in the pack, if you ignore the land, are Quarry Mountain Stalwart, Fortress Kinguard, which is the 2-mana white creature, 1/2 that endures 1, and Jeskai Devotee, the 2-mana red Devotee. So it's the combo of the best cards in the pack are not for the multicolor green deck. The best card in the pack for me is, a land solid. It's a fine pick, but nothing exciting. I tend to like to take good spells over lands early in this format, and so I go, okay, this is a time to speculate. And then I get to the next pack, and it's the same story. The Sultai cards in the pack, not very good. The best one is Durgar Island Dragon, the blue common dragon that has the omen to tap something down. A card I'll play once in a while. Sometimes if I really care about dragons, I'm happy to pick it up, but it's not a card I want to take 5th pick. The best card in the pack is Shot Parade, which is the 2-mana red 1/3 Menace Mobilize 1. One of the best 2-drops you can get for your red-white aggro deck. So the story that the last few picks have told me is, okay, well, I was kind of in the multicolor green space, but I'm getting hints of red-white being open. Let's go to the next pack, see if my suspicions are confirmed. And they are. I get a Descendant of Storms, which is the white 2/1 that whenever you attack, you can pay 2 to endure 2. Premium threat for the red-white aggro decks. And the other best card in the pack, the next best card, is another Shock Brigade. And so the takeaway here, the thing I'm trying to get across, is that the first few picks of the draft, picks 1, 2, 3, those are kind of you take the best cards in the pack. I'll even take a bit of a power level hit if I feel like my start is pretty strong. That pick 3 where I could have taken a better card, but I go, okay, I'm just going to take a card that goes with my first 2 picks that are really strong. But picks 4, 5, 6, I would really stop and just take in everything in the pack. See all of the cards. Because I think a lot of drafters, they kind of lock into okay, well, I'm these colors. Let's look at the cards in those colors, see if they're good. But I think if you're trying to figure out what end of the spectrum you should be in, right? What you're getting fed, either the red-white end of the spectrum or the multicolor green, just kind of snapshot, pick 4 and go, okay, well, what's the density of cards in this pack? Are most of the good ones green, or are most of the good ones for the red-white deck? And then go to pick 5. You do the same thing. Start to build that story. Get to pick 6. Kind of the same thing. And as this draft goes on, good red and white cards keep coming through. I get an 8th pick, Fortress Kinguard. And I ended up in a pretty solid red-white deck. Deck ended up going 4-3. Positive record. I was pretty happy about that. And all of your drafts aren't going to go this smoothly, right? This is a hand-picked, cherry-picked example of, this is very clear that I'm supposed to pivot here. But I think if you just use that technique of, take the first 3 picks, take good cards for your colors, your deck, whatever it is, and then pick 4, 5, 6, then that's where you're going, okay, well, let's see what's open, see if I should pivot. That'll get you a lot of the way there into getting into the right lane for this format. But of course, that raises the question of how does Jeskai tie into all of this? And I think most people right now drafting the format, their approach is take the powerful green cards, multicolor cards, or the Boros cards. Like I mentioned, those are the most common decks, the most obvious decks. But a lot of my drafts start off with just taking a lot of good blue cards. As the format's gone on, I've come around to the idea that blue is the best color. I think that it is both really powerful, lots of really good commons and uncommons, and a little bit underrated. We're going to get into some of those underrated cards here in a second. But often when I get into Jeskai, it's because I've just taken a bunch of good blue cards that are often slower cards, card advantage cards, counter spells, interaction spells. Sometimes that leads into blue-green. If you just get past the good green cards, maybe some of the multicolored green cards, I have no problem pairing my good blue cards with my good green cards. But other times you get past the good red cards, mostly the good red interaction. The red creatures don't add a lot to Jeskai control. But the good red removal spells, and red actually gets a lot of good controlling removal in this set. There's Molten Exhale, which is the 2-mana deal 4. There's Channel Dragonfire, which is the 1-mana deal 2. Harmonize for 7 mana. There's Narset's Rebuke, which is actually a card I've come up and up and up on as the format's gone on, especially in these Jeskai control decks. This is the 5-mana instant, deal 5 to target creature. Then you add Jeskai mana, and if that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. All the parts of this card matter. It being an instant, dealing 5 damage, kills most things. That mana rebate's big. The exile is a big deal. So you get to pair good blue card draw, good blue counter spells with good red interaction. And that's just a recipe, in any limited format for a good control deck. So often my Jeskai decks are base blue-red. I think those as the base colors just give you the most tools for dealing what you need to deal with. And of course, those blue cards, let's just talk about those now. So lots of uncommons I like. Roiling Dragonstorm, 2-mana blue Dragonstorm that draws 2 and discards a card. I've actually had some questions about this one and why it's so good and what you want to do with it. So let me just, go deep on this one quickly. So the idea with Roiling Dragonstorm is that when you cast it early in the game, it smooths out your draw. Right? You're going to hit lands when you need to. You're going to hit spells if you need to. If you can pitch a Harmonize card or a Renew card, in this Jeskai control deck, not a lot of Renew cards, mostly the Harmonize cards, you feel pretty good about that. And then when you pick this up after you cast a dragon, because this Jeskai control deck often plays dragons as its finisher, so some of the uncommon ones, but even the common ones I think are okay. It's actual card advantage at that point, right? Because the first time you cast Roiling Dragonstorm, it's not card advantage, it's just filtering. You use this to go up 2 cards and discard a card. That's card neutral. But when you pick it up again, that's when it's card advantage. And it's such a cheap cost too. So just a really, really premium card draw, card smoothing card. This one's great. It goes like a pick or 2 later than I think it should. Fresh Start. This is another one that I think is great that goes a little bit later than it should. This is the 2-mana flash enchantment that gives something -5/-5, lose all abilities, so just a good blue removal spell. We've got Kishla Trawlers, which is the 3-mana 3/2 that you can buy back a spell from your yard when it enters. Wingblade Disciple, the 3-mana 2/2 that when you cast your second spell each turn, you make a 1/1 token. We've got the Dragonstorm Forecaster, the blue 0/3 that you can pay to tap and go get the Globe or the Boulder Boner Dragon. And then just quickly here, the good blue commons. We've got Riverwalk Technique, which is the 4-mana instant that you can put something on the top or bottom of the controller's library or counter target non-creature spell. Sibsig Appraiser, the best common in the format. Dispelling Exhale, the blue Exhale counterspell. Focus the Mind, the 5-mana draw spell. So just a really healthy handful of good blue cards. You also might start Jeskai if you open Jeskai Revelation, which is the 7-mana instant mythic that does a bajillion things, kills your opponent, makes tokens, gains life, draws cards. You win the game a lot of the time when you just cast this. Or Rediscover the Way, which is the Jeskai saga that is basically like a stock up that then kills your opponent. It's the first 2 chapters are look at the top 3, take a card, and then the 3rd chapter is whenever you cast a non-creature spell this turn, target creature gains double strike. This card's awesome. Both of these cards would incentivize me to draft a Jeskai control deck. You also might open Ugin, the Planeswalker. That incentivizes you to draft a slower deck. You could put this in like a green deck, of course, too. But I do think Jeskai control is a good place for Ugin. So yeah, I'm thinking I might actually go a little bit deeper on talking about Jeskai control next week. I was thinking we might just do an archetype deep dive, but we're still talking about navigation here. And if you're never getting into Jeskai control, I would suggest taking the blue cards higher. Or just in general in the format, bumping up your priority of these good blue cards I talked about. Because all the blue cards I just talked about here, most of them are cards I'm happy to take in the first half of the pack. So if those weren't on your radar, just bump them up a little bit. Next navigation point I want to touch on is just something a bit more broad. The question I've gotten asked a lot this week is, when should you start adding more colors to your deck? The idea being that one of your main goals for draft navigation in this format is try to find a 2-color base. One of those enemy color pairs, red-white, black-white, blue-red, green-blue, and green-black. But what point in the draft should you say, okay, I'm either ready to commit to a 3rd color or a 4th color sometimes? When should you take a good gold card over a good monocolor card in your colors? 2 really broad points that I would bring up is you're much happier to add a 3rd color to your non-white decks. So like your red-white decks and your white-black decks. Because out of the 5 2-color bases here, those are the aggressive decks. And as always, when you splash in an aggressive deck, you make it less consistent. You have to play tap lands. You're going to be fussing around with your mana. Your aggro decks don't have as many card advantage or card filtering tools, so you can't get to your splash colors or your splash cards as often. It's generally not a great idea to splash in your aggro decks. My bar is very high for splashing in those decks, much higher than they would be for splashing in one of the green decks, for example, or even a blue deck, because blue decks, they splash well, not because they have fixing like the green decks do, but because they have a lot of card draw. It's the classic, card draw is fixing. You're able to see a bunch of cards. You're able to find your sources, something that the aggro decks can't do. So in your red-white decks, be very, very picky. I think your black-white decks, might be sometimes a little bit slower, but even then, I would be pretty picky about what I'm splashing for. I think ideally you are keeping it to 2 colors unless you see something just like ridiculously good. I mentioned Sonic Shrieker for the red-white decks, for the Mardu decks. Like, I think you could splash that card. That's the Mardu Dragon. But in a lot of my red-white decks, if they're just open enough, I won't feel the need to splash. Which brings me to my second point of the more your colors are open, whatever your 2 colors of the base are, the less you should splash. The logic there being that if you're just seeing strong monocolored cards or 2-colored cards, there's not as much of a reason to add that 3rd or 4th color. And inversely, the less open your colors are, let's say you end up in red-white, but your colors aren't actually that open, and it's hard to truly pivot to a green deck or something like that. Well, I might not go, okay, let's just, force this red-white aggro deck that's not really getting there. I might add another color. Maybe I pivot into some sort of Jeskai deck. Maybe I pivot into, some sort of Mardu mid-range deck or something like that. So those are the 2 main guidelines I would put forth as to when to add more colors to your deck. I unfortunately cannot give you a complete rundown of like what cards are worth it, what cards are not, because it's going to be contextual based on the draft. This is the puzzle of draft, I think. Like, the reason there is no easy answer is because if there was, then the draft would not be as interesting. But just to give you some examples here, for your Teamer cards, there's Roar of Endless Song, which is the Teamer Saga. That card is busted. There's Carrick Guardian. That card is busted. That's the 6-mana Teamer Dragon. On the other end of things, Bone Karen Butcher. The 4-mana 4/4 Mardu mobilize 2 attacking tokens have Death Touch. I don't think this card is particularly strong. Another card I don't think is particularly strong, Jeskai Brushmaster. This is the 4-mana 2/4 Double Strike Prowess. And it's not to say that I'm never playing these cards, right? Sometimes I do. Like I mentioned, sometimes you get into a more of a Mardu mid-rangey, or, you have to pivot from your red-white deck to some sort of like Jeskai aggro deck. Happens some amount of the time, but you shouldn't actively be going after these kind of cards, right? These are the kind of cards where you go, all right, well, I kind of just need the playable. I kind of need to add another color to my deck. These cards are going to be better than, whatever random monocolored playables I'm seeing. And by the way, just for some context, some insight as to why I don't think these cards are very good, Bone Care Butcher and Jeskai Brushmaster, they just fall right square into the camp of 4 mana or above creature that doesn't have an enter the battlefield effect, doesn't have any protection. Those kind of creatures have proven themselves time and time again in Modern Limited that they are not very good, because when your opponent casts a 2-mana removal spell and gets a big mana advantage, that's a backbreaking moment in the game. It's not all creatures like that. There are some exceptions. There are some I'm happy to play. These aren't some of them, though, especially because they're 3 colors, hard to cast. And one more point I would add here is that no splash is free. Sometimes when I'm doing deck techs or just like, watching people talk about their decks, they'll say, well, I could add this card in. The splash is kind of free because I have these dual lands, or, whatever it is. But no splash is free. It always costs you in some way. Either it's costing you the sources, right? Just like cutting into the sources of your main colors if you have to play basic lands of your splash, or it costs you time because tap lands, that's a cost, right? Like, I think that's a cost people overlook. Tap lands are a cost. So again, yeah, these are all just guidelines. There's no hard and fast rules. And I would say if you're going to be playing the format for a few more weeks, this is probably a point of focus to ask yourself, okay, am I making the right decisions of when to add a color, both in my deck build and in the draft? Am I doing a good job of gauging, are my colors really open and I shouldn't aim towards adding more colors? I should just stay in my 2 colors for the most part. Or am I able to recognize, hey, no particular color is very open, and so I'm more willing to add more colors to my deck to get more power in? One last point on this is that I think when you're blue-green, it's actually not right to be 2 colors all that often, because even though I just said no splash is free, I think that the cost of splashing in blue-green for the power that you get for the powerful Teamer and Sultai cards, that calculus works out in your favor more often than not. Because green gives you fixing, gives you mana fixing. Blue gives you card draw, 2 things that make splashing a little bit easier. And it just so happens that the blue-green base gold cards, I think, are some of the strongest in the set. So that rule kind of doesn't apply to blue-green. I don't think you should end up in straight blue-green basically almost ever. And now that we're nearly halfway through our episode, you know what time it is. It's time to shout out the Patreon. Patreon.com/limitedlevelup. So you can check the link in the description of the podcast feed or the YouTube channel. You can go there if you want to support the channel. If you want to support any of my content, that's the best place to go. And of course, there's a bunch of rewards over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to support us. So do check that out if you enjoy the content, and let's get back to the show. All right, so as we're closing out this section on draft navigation, I want to touch on some decks that are a little more niche, some decks that I think you should keep your eye out for in the coming days and weeks as the format develops, and we've kind of hit that 2-week mark. Right, often in formats on Arena is the point where the format, I think, meaningfully changes, at least in Premier Draft, because what happens, if you haven't heard of this effect before, is when Quick Draft opens up, there's a large portion of players that go over to Quick Draft, and because it's a little bit lower investment, right, it's cheaper to Quick Draft. Usually the strong players stick in Premier Draft because it's higher stakes, and what that means is Premier Draft gets quite a bit harder, quite a bit more, cutthroat. You don't always get the sicko green decks or Boros decks. So I've already felt that actually. I think today was the first day that switch happened, and I was drafting today. And I've been doing really well in this format. Not so well today. I definitely felt it. I had a few like 2-3s and 1-3s, and I had a trophy in there, thankfully. But I think if you're doing well in this format, expect a bit of a dip in the coming week if you're not prepared. And so I want to touch on 2 decks here. The red-blue tempo deck and something in the Obzon space, because Obzon was a deck that I didn't talk about last week. I felt like, it wasn't worth talking about it on week 1 of the format when it's not one of the better decks, but I do have some words on it as we, move into the kind of more scrappy part of the format. But let's start with blue-red. And I mentioned a minute ago that you're going to move into these base 2-color decks that don't splash very often or aren't splashing any cards when your colors are very open. And I've got a deck in front of me here from Jimbo, who's a Discord member. He's a really, really strong drafter. He posted a video of this draft actually in my Discord. And I was super impressed by his draft and by this deck. So just wanted to call this out as something to keep your eye out for. So these colors are open part of this draft is that he picked up 4 Glacial Dragon Hunts, which is an excellent uncommon. This is the blue-red sorcery. Draw a card, then you may discard a card. And when you discard non-land, you deal 3 to something. It's got Harmonize for 6 mana. So this card is removal, gets things out of the way, filters you, makes sure you can keep on double spelling because double spelling is a component of this deck. It's also using close to last pick reverberating summons. We've got 2 copies of that here. This is the 2-mana enchantment that if you cast your second spell, it becomes a 3/3 monk with haste. Also has the ability pay 2, discard your hand, sacrifice this enchantment, draw 2 cards. We've also got Jeskai Devotee in this deck, which is the 2-mana 2/2 that gets +1/+1 when you trigger Flurry. So you're already kind of seeing the shell of this, right? It's just like cheap creatures that hit really hard, want you to double spell. It's also using the other blue-red gold card, which is a card that I have not personally put in a deck yet, but this is Effortless Master, the 4-mana 4/3 Vigilant Menace. If this was the second spell you cast this turn, it enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And the thing that ties the room together, kind of the real punch of this deck, is 2 copies of Wild Ride. Last pick, another last pick card. Wild Ride, single red mana for a sorcery. It gives target creature +3/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. Well, you know what's a really good thing to haste out? The 6/5 Vigilant Menace Effortless Master. So that's a really nice combo on turn 5. So yeah, you're basically just pairing your cheap red creatures with blue tempo spells. If you can get these Dragon Hunts, that's excellent. Wild Ride is a really good tool for pushing damage and keeping your double spells flowing. Just something I thought I'd share here. If you want to check out the video, it's in the Limited Level Ups Discord in the self-promo section. You have to scroll a little bit. But yeah, shout out to Jimbo. Like I said, awesome drafter and very cool deck. A trophy deck, by the way. I didn't mention that, but this one did get to 7 wins in High Mythic. And then yeah, so the Obzon space. What are you doing here? Why do you want to be in it? Well, I think just like that blue-red deck that I showed you, which I don't imagine comes together very often, but does come together when those specific colors are quite open, I think Obzon is kind of the same. I actually had a draft last night where black-green specifically was very open. And when you are black-green without adding a lot of white, you're trying to play it mostly as a beatdown deck. The 2 gold uncommons, I think, are pretty solid. They're nothing amazing, but pretty solid cards. So there's Stalwart Successor, the 3-mana 3/2 Menace. That whenever 1 or more counters are put on a creature you control, if it's the first time that a counter has been put on that creature, you put an additional +1/+1 counter on it. And Host of the Hereafter, the 2 black-green 2/2, enters with 2 +1/+1 counters. When this or another creature you control dies with counters on it, you move those counters somewhere else. There's also the black-green Siege, which is the black-green rare that you either choose Sultai or Obzon. Sultai mode is whenever a counter is placed on a creature you control, draw a card. That triggers only once per turn. Obzon mode is whenever you attack, you put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains menace until end of turn. And my particular path to that draft I had was I first picked Corsi Revenant, which is the 1 black black 3/3 flying Death Touch lifelink, has Renew for 3 mana to exile it from your grave, put a flying lifelink and Death Touch counter on something. I was kind of lucky and I went Revenant into Hollowmark Siege, into some of these black, green, gold cards. And so if you're building this as more of an aggro deck, as more of a proactive deck trying to end the game, you skirt around Abzan's natural problem of being too in the middle, a bit too mid-range. Because I talked briefly about this last week, but I think Abzan's main issue in this format is that it gets totally trounced by the blue or multicolored green decks going over the top of it. And it's got like, I don't know, this is a rough estimate here, but I'd say like a 50-50 matchup versus Boros. So you're not really advantaged against too many decks out there. Your deck has to be really exceptional to feel like you're really doing something. And so if you take more of a proactive role, more of a, hey, I'm more on the Boros side of things, trying to punish the blue decks and the multicolored green decks, I think you have something there. I think that the Siege, the black-green Siege, is a good reason to speculate on going into this deck. I think that, like I mentioned, the gold uncommons are a good reason for that. I called out Corsi Revenant as my first pick from that draft because when I first pick a double black card, that kind of ties your hands a little bit, right? I mean, you know, there's not... Black-white is not one of my favorite decks, and, you know, black-green is, you know, what we're talking about here, not one of my favorite decks unless you're drafting it in a certain way. So I was like, okay, where do I really want to go with this card? And I think that, yeah, black-green aggressive decks are kind of an answer to that. And 2 cards I want to call out here at common that I think are pretty good for those decks are Snakeskin Veil and Aggressive Negotiation. So Snakeskin Veil, everybody knows and hates Snakeskin Veil. Single green mana, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature against hexproof. And Aggressive Negotiations, I think this card is legit in this deck, because one of the problems with the black-green is that it actually has kind of a tough time getting counters on cards. Kind of funny enough, there aren't a lot of great cards that put counters on cards. And I think this is one that's above average. So this is the 3 mana sorcery in black. Target opponent reveals their hand, you exile a card from that, and then you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this card's role in an aggressive deck is to clear the way, right? Get rid of your opponent's interaction. Get rid of the creatures that are going to block them. So if you just go 2-drop, potentially something like Formation Breaker, which is the green 2/1 that gets +1/+0 as long as the creature you control has a counter on it, and creatures with power less than the Formation Breaker can't block it. Go that into Aggressive Negotiations. That's a really quick clock. And there's also some reasons to be like the full-on Abzan mid-rangey deck. I think if you're there, you still want to be like proactive mid-range rather than like slower mid-range. You know, I'd consider like a blue-green deck in this format splashing, you know, maybe a few cards. It's not like you're not going way over the top, you're not splishy, splashy, all 5 colors. You're like blue-green, splash a few good red cards. That's like reactive, slower blue-green. You're like, okay, maybe I run you over, but most of the time, I'm just kind of trying to outcard you. I think that when you're Abzan, you're like black-green base, proactive mid-range, where you're like, I'm mostly trying to kill you, but if the game goes a little longer, if you stall me out, I'm not just dead. I have some grindy tools. And if you're there, or the reasons to go there, I should say, are Baitor, Kin to All, which is the mythic Abzan dragon, 5 mana, 5/7 flying that draws cards if you have total toughness 10 or greater at the end of your turn, untaps all your creatures if you have total toughness 20 or greater, and your opponent loses half their life if you have total toughness 40 or greater. I don't know how you're ever getting to that before you kill your opponent, but, you know, it's on the card. I guess it's a commander line of text. The other card that really pulls me into Abzan specifically is Revival of the Ancestors. This is the Abzan Saga that makes a bunch of tokens, puts a bunch of counters on things, gives things lifelink and trample. Like, these are the 2 cards that are worth it, adding actual white mana to your deck. There's like Skirmish Rhino at uncommon. That's a fine card. I don't think it's quite strong enough to really strive for the whites or strive for the 3rd color if you're like black-green base. These are the 2 big ones. So yeah, this draft navigation section took a lot longer than I actually expected it to, but you know, we covered a lot of stuff. So hopefully this gives you a little more confidence. I kind of wanted to touch on like, okay, once you're in these decks, then let's get to the second part of the draft. Like, what are you aiming for? Like, what's the balance of tricks and removal in your red-white deck, for example? What's the balance of like fixing and removal and card draw in your slower multicolor decks? I think, just kind of episode planning on the spot here, I think we might do that next week. So let me know if you want me to like go deep on that. Maybe we can really go into the specifics of, what each deck in the format really wants. I mentioned talking about Jeskai. So maybe we'll just handpick a few decks and do that. Like I said, let me know if that's interesting to you. All right, finally, time to move on to our second portion of the episode. Second level up, some card evaluation. So I've got a handful of cards that I want to talk about, give some thoughts. Some underrated cards, some cards that, maybe aren't generally underrated, but have more homes than it might look like on first glance. Talk about some blue cards. I love blue cards, so why not? So first one, this is one that I talked about last week, but I wanted to just clarify a few things on. So this is Dragonstorm Forecaster, the blue 0/3 that you can pay to tap it, go and get the Dragonstorm Globe or Boulderborn Dragon. I've got a lot of questions this week about where do you take this card? Do you have to have the Globe before you want this card? Are you happy to speculate on the Forecaster? And, I think when you have the Globe, the Forecaster becomes a very high pick, especially if you are a multicolor deck. One thing that I was going to mention, talking about what, each deck really wants, is that if you're a multicolored green deck, Globe, as I'm sure a lot of people know, is just one of the best cards. Like one of the cards you absolutely want. This is the 3-mana rock that puts a counter on your dragons, of course. And just having a 5-color fixer just makes all the difference in those decks that are trying to cast 4 or 5 colors of cards. And so if you have a Globe and you really care about it, either you're in a heavy dragon deck or just a heavy multicolor deck, I really prioritize the Forecaster at that point. Because then it's a virtual second copy of a card that you would love to see every game. Also just gives you something to do with your mana, lets you go get the Boulderborn Dragon. So yeah, if I have the first Globe, then I'm like, yes, absolutely, Forecaster high pick. If I don't have the Globe, I still think it's a fairly high pick. I won't take it over some of the other good blue cards. There was all those blue cards I mentioned earlier in the episode. This is on the lower end of things if you don't already have the Globe. But once you have the Globe, yeah, I'm really into it, and I don't mind speculating on it. The other thing, I was talking to somebody in a coaching session today, and, they had a moment of revelation in the coaching session, like, oh, you don't just have to have one, and one, right? Like, I think that the package is like one Forecaster, one Globe, one Dragon. You would have 2 Dragons. You would have 2 Globes, right? This Forecaster can draw you multiple cards over the course of the game. So, just wanted to call it out for anybody else who might have thought that, for some reason you were limited to just 1/1. No, it's great. It can draw you tons of cards. I think the most common mix, if you had the choice, like if you were just handed infinite copies of all 3 of these cards, is like 1 Forecaster, 2 Globes, 1 Dragon, because you don't really want to draw multiple Forecasters. You also don't want to draw multiple Boulderborn Dragons, but you're fairly happy drawing multiple Globes. Veteran Ice Climber. This is a 1 and a blue 1/3 Vigilance and uncommon. It can't be blocked, and whenever it attacks up to 1 target player, mills cards equal to this creature's power. So I think this is sort of a synergy card, sort of not exactly a build around. I don't like take this and put other cards in my deck to make it better. But if you're in a blue-green deck that really uses its graveyard nicely, has renew cards, ideally renew cards, not just harmonized cards, because renew cards putting counters on this and milling yourself quickly, like ideally the setup for this card, where I really want it, is I've got maybe 4 or 5 renew cards, a few harmonized cards, and when this thing attacks, not only is it a pretty beefy creature if you can put even just like 1 counter on it, but it starts virtually drawing you cards, right? You just start to turn your deck over. And at some point, in these kind of mirror matches, the slow blue decks, you just go, all right, well, we'll just make this a 3-power creature and mill you for 3 every turn. If you can't answer this, you just die. It's really great with Lasad Prowler, which is the 4-mana 5/5 at rare, that when it enters, you mill cards equal number of lands you control, and you can renew for 2 mana to put X +1/+1 counters on something, or X number of lands in your graveyard, so you can kind of just one-shot your opponent if you got these 2 cards. Not a card I take very highly, but when I'm in the right deck, I think it turns into a premium card at some point. Again, that point is like, I don't know, I would say like 7 cards you're casting from your graveyard. And then a type of card that I talk about almost every set, Riverwalk Technique. This is the 4-mana blue instant. Choose 1. The owner of target non-land permanent puts it on their choice, top or bottom of their library, or counter non-creature spell. So I often say that drafters, I don't know if it's arena drafters or just drafters in general, tend to underrate this effect. I'm not seeing it as true removal, right? And it does have its issues, for sure. You don't want to top a creature with a good end to the battlefield effect. But in this set, I think this is one of the best versions of this effect we've had. because not only are there some big tokens running around, 5/5 tokens, killing that with this is pretty good, but the negate mode is just so good. And I did talk about this card last week, but I really wanted to hammer it home because I am seeing this card quite late in draft still. It's not one I think people have picked up on, and I'm happy playing 2 copies, 3 copies sometimes. We've had sets where this kind of effect is not particularly good, but I think when it comes down to the story forming across multiple sets of, multiple iterations of this kind of effect is if you just tack on a little something, it turns from mediocre/bad to really good, actually, a solid uncommon and one of the better ones in some cases. So, like, for example, there's the one from Duskmorn. That one added a Surveil. I think it was a Surveil or a Scry. That one was pretty good. The vanilla versions that just don't do anything else, they're just like, just top or bottom. I think that's not as good. And we've had formats like, 5 years ago where that base card was good, but Magic's evolved a little bit since then. I think you need a little more oomph on your card. So yeah, just from a card evaluation perspective, and you're looking at future sets, I would just say if this effect does a little something extra, even just having another mode like Riverwalk Technique here, probably going to be a pretty good version of the effect. One white card to call out here, Tempest Hawk. So this is the 3-mana 2/2 flyer. Then whenever it deals damage to your opponent, you can search your library for another Tempest Hawk, put it into your hand. I think this card is a fairly solid playable in your red-white decks. And you want, around 3 or 4 copies. That's kind of the sweet spot. I don't really take it highly still, but, sometimes when you move into red-white, you have a draft like, the one I showed you earlier, where you didn't start there, you pivot into it because, wow, it's really open. And then maybe somebody else also moves in because they also thought it was really open. So I don't think it's a premium card for those decks or anything, but it's a card that you get very late that I'm happy to fill up my deck with. Again, you do need to have those 3 copies. I don't think 2 is good enough. I also don't think you want 5 because then at 5 you kind of risk drawing too many in your opening hand, and you just you don't want too many 3-minute 2/2 flyers. You want mostly real cards and this to just draw you the rest of them. But yeah, I just wanted to put it on people's radar as a good way to fill out your red-white aggro deck if you're missing some playables. Speaking of red-white aggro, so some cards that I want to shout out here that are pretty good there. So Fleeting Effigy, the single red mana 2/2 haste that returns to your hand at the end step. And you can pay 3 mana to give it +2/+0. So just, baseline, this thing maybe does the first 4 points of damage. If your 1 mana spell is responsible for 4 points, that's not so bad. Later in the game, it trades up. It also goes up in value if you have any of the cards that care about Flurry. So there's the red-white 3/3 at uncommon, right? The one that drains your opponent for 2 whenever you cast your second spell per turn. Well, that plus this drains your opponent out really quickly. On an empty board, or if you can clear the way, that's a ton of damage. Your opponent's just like very dead. But it's a good way to just keep the persistent damage going if you're a little bit stalled or, you're not quite pushing damage at the rate you need to. So, yeah, I kind of think of this as a slightly above replacement level card for the red-white aggro decks. And if you're in, like, that Jimbo blue-red deck, I think it's going to be really, really good there. This is exactly the kind of card you want because not only does it enable your double spell cards, but in your blue-red deck, you often have a lot of ways to clear the way. So this thing can get it every turn. You're going to pump it some turns too. So yeah, just wanted to call this out because sometimes this kind of effect, the cheap creature that you return to your hand is not very good. I think this is a good version of it with the context of the set. War Effort is a 4-mana enchantment that says your creatures get +0/+1. And whenever you attack, you make a tapped mobilized token, basically. 1/1 tapped and attacking that sack at the end step. I think I might have died to this card more than any card when playing the Jeskai control decks I like to play, because what happens with this is if you don't have great blockers, which you often don't in your control decks, you have to answer every single one of your opponent's threats, or else this just deals you way too much damage. If you're ahead as the red-white aggro deck, this really closes the door. A card I really like. Not a card you want to play anywhere else. It's just to do nothing on defense. You absolutely have to be attacking each turn, have to have a high creature count. This is not some weird, card you can put in your teamer deck. Not that I think many people are, but just really want to highlight this as a really good card for those red-white aggro decks. I think the best of the pump effects, to kind of put it into some context. There's a variety of the pump effects. I think this is the best one for those decks. A combat trick I've been playing a lot more in said red-white decks. Fire Room Form, the 2-mana aura that comes in. It's got flash, gives something +2/+0, and first strike when it enters, or I should say first strike when it enters, and the permanent +2/+0. Yeah, this was just pretty nice. You win a combat, sticks around, lots of power, pretty darn good on a Shock Brigade, right? The 1/3 menace. If your opponent double blocks, you can really get them. And then you have a 3/3 menace creature. I find a lot of drafting red-white when it's not wide, completely open, and nobody's touching it, is figuring out what scrappy cards work in your deck well, like the Tempest Hawk, like this kind of card. And there's a variety of tricks you could be playing, but this one I think you want to play the most when you have Shock Brigade, when you're incentivizing double blocks. A green card here that I'm actually not going to talk too much about. This is Champion of Doosan. I mentioned this one earlier, a card I like, I think, more than the general population. 3 mana, 4/2 Trampler in green with Renew to put a +1/+1 and a trample counter on something. I'm actually going to point you towards a new podcast from Sam Pratt, who you might have heard his name on Lords Unlimited. If you listen to Lords Unlimited, he's another really great drafter in my Discord, and he just launched his own podcast, and I've really liked it. Just want to put you onto this if you're looking for some more podcast content. So the whole idea of it, he goes really deep on individual cards. It's a shorter podcast, usually like 20 minutes. He's got like 4 episodes out at this point. One of the ones he went deep on, Champion of Doosan, and the reasons why it's good where you want it, where it's really good. So I'm going to outsource my thoughts on that to Sam. I'm going to link that in the description. Like I said, really liked it. High praise from me, and high praises from Mark as well. My set review partner, Mark. And Mark's got a high bar for content. So that's a real compliment. So yeah, if you want to add one more podcast to the roster, would highly recommend. And then one more card here that I will plug my own content, Glacierwood Siege. This is the rare blue-green siege that mills a player when you cast instant or sorcery, or the Sultai mode is you can play lands from your graveyard. I just wanted to call this one out as I made a whole video about this earlier in the week, about how to use this card, when you want this card, a build around. Just want to shut this out for people who might not have caught it, because I think it's a really real card, and it's a cool card. It's a card you get really late. So yeah, if you're interested in going deep on a card that makes its way around the table often, go check that out. I will also link to that in the description. And then our final section here, the gameplay level up section. And this is going to be the shortest of the bunch. It's a pretty straightforward idea, but I think one that's really going to help if you just start thinking about it more as you're playing the games. So one of the dynamics at play in this format is there's a ton of cheap removal, right? We've got the Exhales. Those are all 2-mana interaction spells. There's stuff like Fresh Start, the blue aura that gives them thing -5, -0. There's a lot of counter magic, and it can kind of feel like, especially if you're playing like a red-white aggro deck, or, a bit more of a beatdown deck, like, I don't know what to play around here. There's so many things I could be playing around here. Should I be playing around anything? Or I think more importantly, just being aware of the fact that, oh, hey, the opponent probably has one of these instants up. Like, maybe it's one of these cheap Exhales, could be a counter spell, could be an instant speed Omen, like the Blue Dragon. And so it can be easy to disguise the fact that you've got a lot of instants. Like, say you're the control player, or the slower player that's holding up their mana. There's instant speed card draw spells in this set. There's like some other things you can do with your mana instant speed. As the person playing against those kind of cards, you really want to be aware of when your opponent is tipping you off that they might have, or probably do have, some of these responses, so that you don't go for a trick at a time where it's not good to. Or you don't jam your one threat into, tap out, they cast Dispelling Exhale, and they counter your 5-drop for 2 mana. Instead, you play around that by playing 2 spells, potentially. Well, the one thing that is in your favor as the player is trying to play around this is there's actually quite a lot of things in this set to spend your mana on at sorcery speed only. Some of the things I'm thinking about are Renew. There's also Harmonize cards, and there's also the Monuments, right? The artifacts, the sacrifices, and make tokens. And so really take note when your opponent has those things in their graveyard and they haven't cast them, and they pass the turn. That should immediately raise an alarm bell to you, right? That should be like, okay, well, let's, put on the slow thinking cap here and think, what could this be? And like I said a minute ago, the real key here is identifying that there is something in the first place. I know a lot of players, they're very focused on their own spells, right? Just like what they're going to do on their turn. And you should be focused on your own stuff first, right? If you have trouble sequencing your own stuff, don't worry. Like, this is level 2, level 3 stuff. Focus on sequencing your own stuff first. But, if you think you're at the point where you're trying to level up your gameplay, this is a really, really easy thing in this format to do, to really make it so you aren't getting outplayed all the time. And to take this a step further, I don't even think it needs to be as obvious as, there's a Renew card, or there's a Harmonize card in their graveyard they didn't cast, they have something. Anytime the opponent passes with mana up in this format, even just 2 mana, I'm kind of already a bit hesitant about, jamming a combat trick, doing something that could get disrupted by a removal spell. Just because the prevalence of the number of things there are to do with, 2 or 3 mana instant speed, there are so many that it's very likely that if your opponent hasn't used all their mana on their turn, they probably have something. So I play fairly cautiously in this format. The next level of this, of course, is if you're putting your opponent on something, maybe a counter spell, maybe it's, the exhale, maybe it's a removal spell, whatever. You had a moment in the game where you're like, oh, they passed the turn with some mana up. It might be one of those cards. You look for opportunities where they would have used it and then didn't. Because then I can say, okay, they actually don't have that card. So, a combat trick is a really obvious one. If you do cast a combat trick and they don't cast a removal spell in response or a counter spell, well, they don't have that. I think most spots, people are just going to cast their interaction spell there. That's kind of level 3 of this. Going, I think they have this. Let me test the waters and kind of see, do they have this? Or just any of the plays I make, there might be a moment that I come across that I go like, oh, okay, they would have cast this. They would have countered this spell if they had it. I can cross that off my list of things they might have. So maybe it's a -3, or an instant speed molten exhale instead. Maybe it's one of those. Keep a running list of those kind of things. The other thing I want to touch on that's related is playing with the counter spells and the counter magic in this set and figuring out when to leave up mana. Because I think classically this is one of the things that is pretty difficult as a limited player. If you're not used to constructed and control decks, or you just haven't been playing limited a long time, you're not used to when counter spells are good, because counter spells aren't good every single set. There's some sets that they're good and there's some sets are not, and this one they are pretty good. There's the question of like, should I tap out or should I leave up my counter spell? And this one's a little more contextual. I don't think I can give you a straightforward always yes, always no kind of answer, but I can give you some guidelines. So you should leave up a counter spell if you can't afford for a 5/5 to resolve, or, heaven forbid, a bomb or something like that. Basically, if you're playing a slower deck and you don't have an answer to the next biggest threat they could have, then yeah, it's probably a good idea to leave up a counter spell rather than affect the board. Now, this is counterbalanced by how much pressure are you getting put on you, right? Like if your opponent's attacking you for 6 a turn and you don't have any blockers, well, at that point you probably might have to cast your sorcery speed or removal spell. But that's where the push and pull comes. That's actually the trickiest part, because it's like, well, can I afford to take 6 damage this turn and then counter their 5-drop and then untap and then cast the removal spell? Because if I do this in the opposite order, I answer their creature and then their spell resolves and I can't answer their next creature. That's actually kind of a problem. And so, yeah, this isn't meant to give you an answer, but it's meant to tell you the things you should be thinking about. And this is another thing, please let me know if you want to go deep. I haven't done a pure gameplay episode for, a given set in the past few sets, but I might do it for this one, because I think there's some good things to talk about you can apply to other sets too. So let me know if you want that. Another thing about the counter spells, just quickly, is that if you're ahead, just keep it up, right? Like if you're the control deck, you're in for full control, don't tap out for that dragon, right? That 6-mana dragon. Just wait a turn. Wait till you get to turn 8. If you've got a Dispelling Exhale that's going to counter most of their stuff, they're on 5 mana. Just be patient, right? Just really be patient. Just channel the control player mindset. That's another pretty reliable heuristic. Like when you're ahead, you just want to make sure they don't resolve anything great, so you can be cautious. So yeah, I hope this gameplay corner was a little bit helpful, just to give you some ideas of what you should be thinking about in given spots. And yeah, like I said, let me know if you want more of this stuff. That's going to do it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're watching on YouTube, do feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. The best way to support the channel, if you don't want to support in a monetary way, go to Patreon. Just, simple like and subscribe if you're not already, really goes a long way. That's going to do it. We'll see you next time, everybody.